Sometimes the heart finds exactly what it needs in the last place it ever thought to look. And sometimes two broken people discover that healing doesn't come from running away, but from standing still long enough to let someone see the truth. High in the Wyoming mountains, there's a cabin where a reclusive man named Silas Boone lives alone with his grief. When Annie Boyd arrives looking for work, she makes one thing clear. She's not there for love, just wages. But in that quiet cabin, something neither of them expected begins to take root. What happens when two people who've sworn off love find themselves facing a truth they can't ignore? Before we begin, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sometimes the heart finds exactly what it needs in the last place it ever thought to look. And sometimes two broken people discover that healing doesn't come from running away, but from standing still long enough to let someone see the truth. High in the Wyoming mountains, there's a cabin where a reclusive man named Silas Boone lives alone with his grief. When Annie Boyd arrives looking for work, she makes one thing clear. She's not there for love, just wages. But in that quiet cabin, something neither of them expected begins to take root. What happens when two people who've sworn off love find themselves facing a truth they can't ignore? Before we begin, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Annie Boyd had made the decision 3 days before she started the climb up the mountain. 3 days of watching her father's hands shake as he tried to count what little money they had left. 3 days of seeing the worry lines deepen around his eyes, the way he'd stare at the farm ledger like it might suddenly reveal a miracle tucked between the columns of debt. The farm wasn't going to make it through another winter. They both knew it, though neither had spoken the words aloud. She'd heard about the job in town, whispered over the counter at Morrison's general store. Silas Boone, the mountain man, needed a housekeeper. The last 3 women had quit within a week. He was too strange, too quiet, too much like a ghost living among the living. But the pay was good, better than good. And Annie Boyd had learned long ago that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. The path up the mountain was steep and winding, cutting through stands of pine and aspen that grew thicker as she climbed. October had painted the aspens gold, and they shimmered in the afternoon light like coins scattered across the hillside. Her breath came harder as the elevation increased, and she had to stop twice to rest, setting down the small canvas bag that held everything she owned. A few dresses, a nightgown, her mother's Bible, and tucked in the bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, the thin gold band she'd worn for 2 years before Thomas died. She'd taken it off that morning, left it on the windowsill of her room at her father's house. It seemed important somehow to leave that part of herself behind. Where she was going, she needed to be just Annie, not Annie the widow, not Annie the grieving wife, just Annie who needed work and knew how to keep her head down and her hands busy. The cabin appeared suddenly, tucked into a clearing where the trees fell back and the mountain opened up to sky. It was larger than she'd expected, built from logs that had weathered to a deep silver gray. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and firewood was stacked neatly along the side wall covered with canvas tarps. The porch wrapped around the front, and someone had carved the railings with a careful hand. Patterns of leaves and vines that spoke of patience and skill. Annie stood at the edge of the clearing for a moment, gathering her courage. This was it. This was the choice she'd made. She straightened her shoulders, smoothed her skirt, and walked to the door. Her knock was firm, 3 solid raps that echoed in the quiet. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she heard footsteps inside, slow and deliberate, and the door swung open. Silas Boone was not what she expected. The stories made him sound like something barely human, a wild creature who'd forgotten how to live among people. But the man who stood in the doorway was simply a man. Tall and broad-shouldered, yes, with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that shadowed his jaw. His eyes were grey, the color of storm clouds, and they studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she didn't. She met his gaze and held it. "Mr. Boone," she said. "I'm Annie Boyd. I've come about the job." He didn't speak right away, just looked at her, taking in her worn traveling dress, her sturdy boots, the way she stood straight despite the long climb. Finally he stepped back and gestured for her to enter. "Come in then." The cabin's interior surprised her even more than the man. It was clean, almost painfully so, with wide plank floors that gleamed in the firelight. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and in front of it sat two chairs, handmade, like everything else, with cushions that looked recently beaten clean of dust. The kitchen area occupied the far end of the room, with a black iron stove, a deep sink with a hand pump, and open shelves lined with dishes and supplies. Everything had its place. Everything was ordered and maintained, but it was the small details that caught her attention. Two coffee cups sat on the table, as if waiting for someone who never came. A hand-carved wooden box rested on the mantel above the fireplace, dark walnut with brass hinges, and next to it several photographs lay face down, their backs to the room. The curtains were drawn back to let in light, but the windows looked out on nothing but trees and sky. No neighbors, no town, no other signs of human life. "You'll have the loft," Silas said, his voice rough from disuse. He pointed to a ladder that led to a small second floor tucked under the eaves. "There's a bed, a chest for your things. I keep to myself mostly. I expect you'll do the same." Annie nodded. "I'm here to work, Mr. Boone. That's all." Something flickered in his eyes. Relief, maybe, or recognition. "Good cooking, cleaning, mending. I can't pay much, but it's fair wages, and you'll have a roof and meals. That's more than fair." He moved to the table and picked up one of the coffee cups, seemed to realize what he was doing, and set it back down carefully. "You'll start tomorrow. Today you can settle in, get your bearings. Supper's at 6. I can cook tonight, if you like." "Tomorrow," he said again, and there was something in his tone that made it clear the discussion was over. Annie climbed the ladder to the loft, her bag slung over her shoulder. The space was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a wooden chest at the foot, and a small window that looked out over the clearing. Someone had made this space with care, the same someone who carved the porch railings and kept the floors swept clean. She unpacked slowly, hanging her dresses on pegs along the wall, folding her nightgown and placing it in the chest. Her mother's Bible went on the small table beside the bed. She stood for a moment looking around at this space that would be hers and felt something settle in her chest. Not quite peace, but close to it. A sense of rightness, of being where she needed to be, even if she didn't fully understand why. That evening, Silas cooked a simple meal, venison stew with potatoes and carrots, biscuits that were slightly burned on the bottom but good nonetheless. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the crackle of the fire. Annie wanted to say something, to break the quiet, but she sensed that Silas preferred it this way. Silence wasn't discomfort for him. It was a language he spoke fluently. After the meal, she offered to wash the dishes. He nodded and retreated to one of the chairs by the fire, picking up a piece of wood and a carving knife. She watched him from the corner of her eye as she worked. The way his hands moved with practiced skill, shaving thin curls of wood that fell to the floor like snow. When the kitchen was clean, Annie said goodnight and climbed back to the loft. She changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed, looking out the window at the stars that had begun to appear in the darkening sky. Below, she could hear Silas moving around, banking the fire, checking the door. She thought about her father, alone in the farmhouse. She thought about Thomas, about the life she'd imagined that never came to be. And she thought about the man downstairs, living in this beautiful, lonely place with his 2 coffee cups and his face-down photographs. What had she gotten herself into? But even as the question formed, she knew she wasn't going to leave. Something about this place, about the quiet and the stillness, felt like exactly what she needed. Not comfort, but the space to breathe. The space to be something other than grief. Annie lay down and pulled the quilt up to her chin. Tomorrow she would work. Tomorrow she would earn her keep. And maybe, if she was lucky, she would figure out how to live again. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the rising moon. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that Annie hadn't known she needed. She rose before dawn, started the fire in the stove, and had coffee brewing by the time Silas came down from his room behind the kitchen. They didn't speak much in those early hours, just a nod of greeting, maybe a comment about the weather or the work planned for the day. But the silence between them was comfortable, the kind that comes from two people who understand that not everything needs to be said aloud. Annie cleaned and cooked and mended, and found a strange satisfaction in the simple, repetitive tasks. There was something healing about kneading bread dough, about scrubbing floors until they gleamed, about mending a torn shirt so carefully that you could barely see where the fabric had ripped. Her hands stayed busy, and when her hands were busy, her mind couldn't wander too far into the dark places where grief still waited. Silas kept mostly to himself, as promised. He spent his days checking trap lines, hunting, chopping wood, doing the 100 small tasks that kept a mountain homestead running. But Annie noticed things. The way he always set out 2 coffee cups in the morning, then seemed surprised to find the second one still full when he came in for lunch. The way he'd pause sometimes, standing at the window, staring out at nothing, with an expression that looked like he was listening for a voice that would never answer. The way he avoided the small room off the kitchen, the one with the door always closed. She didn't ask about any of it. She'd come here for work, not to pry into a stranger's sorrows. God knew she had enough of her own, but on a cold morning in early November, everything changed. Annie was cleaning the main room, dusting the mantel and the shelves, when she noticed a loose board near the base of the bookshelf. It wasn't really loose, just slightly warped, pulled up at one corner as if something beneath had shifted. She knelt down, intending to press it back into place, but when she touched it, the board lifted easily. Beneath it was a small space, and tucked inside was a photograph. She shouldn't have picked it up. She knew that even as her fingers closed around the edges of the frame. But something about it called to her, some instinct that this was important. That this was the key to understanding the man who moved through this cabin, like a ghost in his own life. The photograph showed 3 people. A younger Silas, clean-shaven and smiling in a way she'd never seen, his arm around a beautiful woman with dark hair and bright eyes. And in front of them, held between them, a boy of maybe 6 or 7 grinning at the camera with gap-toothed joy. They were standing in front of this very cabin, the porch behind them, and the love between them was so evident it seemed to radiate from the image itself. Annie's chest tightened. She understood suddenly so many things. The 2 coffee cups, the closed door, the photographs turned face down on the mantel, the wooden box that Silas never touched but never moved. This wasn't just a man who preferred solitude. This was a man who had lost everything. That's Clara and Daniel. Annie startled so badly she nearly dropped the photograph. Silas stood in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders, his expression unreadable. She hadn't heard him come in. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, setting the photograph down with trembling hands. "I was just cleaning and the board was loose, and I didn't mean to—" "It's all right." He crossed the room slowly, his boots leaving melting tracks on the clean floor. He picked up the photograph and looked at it for a long moment. "I put it there 5 years ago. Sometimes I forget it's even there. Other times I can't forget for a second." Annie stood, unsure whether to leave or stay. But something in Silas's face kept her rooted in place. He looked different somehow, not harder, but more present, as if the photograph had pulled him back from wherever he usually resided. "She was my wife," he said quietly. "Clara and Daniel was our son." He was 7 in this picture. Would have been 12 now if— His voice caught and he stopped. Annie waited. She understood about grief, about how sometimes you needed to let the words come in their own time. Or not at all. Silas moved to the fireplace and stood looking at the flames. "Winter fever. 5 years ago last March. First Daniel got sick, then Clara while she was nursing him. I rode down the mountain for the doctor, but by the time we got back," he shook his head, "they were both gone within 3 days of each other. Clara went second, I think she held on as long as she could, hoping Daniel would pull through. When he didn't, she just let go. "I'm so sorry," Annie said, and the words felt painfully inadequate. "I buried them down in Timber Ridge in the church cemetery. Sold our house there. Couldn't stand to be in the place where it happened. Came up here thinking the distance would help, that if I just got far enough away from everything, I could outrun it." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Turns out grief travels real well. Doesn't matter how far you go." Annie moved closer, not too close, but near enough that he'd know she was listening. "I lost my husband 3 years ago," she said. "Thomas, logging accident up near the ridge. One minute he was there and the next." She paused, swallowed. "People kept telling me time would heal it, that it would get easier. They were wrong. It doesn't get easier. You just get better at carrying it." Silas looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, the knowledge that they were speaking a language most people never had to learn. "How old were you when he died?" 22. "We'd been married 2 years. Clara and I had 10 years together. 10 years and one beautiful boy, and I thought that would be my whole life. Thought I'd grow old with her, watch Daniel grow up, have grandchildren someday." He set the photograph on the mantel, face up this time. "Guess we don't get to choose how the story goes." "No," Annie agreed. "We don't." They stood in silence for a while, both looking at the photograph. Annie could feel something shifting between them, some wall coming down that had been there since she arrived. It wasn't that they were suddenly close. They were still two people who barely knew each other, but they were two people who understood loss, and that was its own kind of kinship. "The room off the kitchen," Silas said finally. "That was Daniel's. I haven't opened it since I moved his things up here from town. Can't quite bring myself to go in there, but I can't bring myself to change it either. Would you like me to clean it?" Annie asked carefully. "Or would you rather I left it alone?" "I don't know," he admitted. Maybe it's time. Or maybe I'm not ready. I honestly don't know." "There's no right answer," Annie said. "Whatever feels true to you, that's what's right." Silas nodded slowly. "What did you do after your husband died?" "I went home to my father's farm. Tried to help him keep it running, but my heart wasn't in it. Wasn't in much of anything for a long time. Some days I still feel like I'm just going through the motions, waiting for life to feel real again." "Does it feel real?" Annie considered this. More than it did. Being up here, having work to do, having something to focus on besides grief, it helps. Not all the way, but some. "That's why I came up here too," Silas said. "Thought if I could just stay busy enough, work hard enough, I wouldn't have time to think about what I'd lost. But the mountain's a quiet place. Plenty of time to think, whether you want to or not. Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Annie suggested. "The thinking. The remembering. Maybe we're not supposed to outrun it. Maybe we're just supposed to learn to live alongside it." Silas turned to her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he really smiled. It was small and sad, and didn't quite reach his eyes, but it was genuine. "You're wise for someone so young." "I don't feel young," Annie said. "Haven't for a while now. I know that feeling." They stood there as the afternoon light began to fade. Two people who had known profound loss, who had come to this mountain for different reasons, but found themselves in the same place nonetheless. And though neither of them said it aloud, both understood that something had changed between them. They weren't just employer and employee anymore. They were two people who had looked into the darkness and survived it, and that created a bond that was hard to name, but impossible to ignore. Later that evening, after a quiet supper, Silas did something he hadn't done before. He brought out the wooden box from the mantel and set it on the table between them. "These are letters," he said. "Clara used to write me letters, even though we lived in the same house. Little notes she'd leave in my lunch pail or tuck into my coat pocket. I saved every one." He touched the box gently, as if it were something sacred. "Haven't been able to read them since she died. But I keep them here where I can see them. A reminder that love was real, even if it's gone now." And he felt tears prick her eyes. "That's beautiful, or foolish. I haven't decided which. It's not foolish to honor what you loved." "That's not foolish at all," Silas opened his mouth as if to say something more, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he picked up the box and returned it to the mantel, next to the photograph that now faced the room. Annie watched him, and something stirred in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not love. It was too soon for that, and they barely knew each other. But possibility, the faint, frightening possibility that maybe grief didn't have to be the end of the story. That maybe there was something beyond just surviving, if you were brave enough to reach for it. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the loft, Annie thought about the photograph and the letters and the quiet way Silas had shared his story with her. She thought about Thomas, about the life they'd planned that would never be. And she thought about the fact that she'd come to this mountain looking for work, for a way to help her father, for a reason to keep putting one foot in front of the other. But maybe, just maybe, she'd found something more, something she hadn't known she was looking for until it appeared in front of her in the form of a grieving man who set out 2 coffee cups every morning and kept love letters in a wooden box on his mantel. She didn't know what to do with that realization. Didn't know if she should lean into it or run from it. All she knew was that something had shifted today, and she couldn't quite go back to the person she'd been when she climbed up this mountain 3 weeks ago. Outside, the wind howled and snow began to fall in earnest. Winter was coming to the high country, and with it, a different kind of season entirely. The days that followed were different, though Annie couldn't quite put her finger on how. The work was the same. Cooking, cleaning, mending, all the tasks that kept the cabin running smoothly. But the silence between her and Silas had changed. It was no longer the careful, distant quiet of strangers sharing a space. It was the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had seen each other's scars and chosen not to look away. Silas began to talk more. Not constantly. He was still a man of few words, but he'd share things as they worked together. Stories about the mountain, about tracking elk and reading weather patterns, about the way the forest changed with the seasons. He taught her how to read the sky for coming storms, how to tell fresh snow from old by the way it crunched underfoot, how to follow animal tracks and understand the stories they told. Annie found herself looking forward to these lessons, to the sound of his voice explaining the world around them. There was something calming about the way Silas understood the mountain, the way he moved through it with confidence and respect. He wasn't trying to conquer it or control it. He was simply living alongside it, and there was wisdom in that. One afternoon, as they worked together to repair the barn roof before the heavy snows came, Silas paused and looked out over the valley below. Clara used to say that the mountain was God's cathedral, he said. That the pines were the pillars and the sky was the ceiling, and if you listened close enough, you could hear hymns in the wind. She sounds like she was a poet, Annie said, hammering a nail into place. She was. Used to write verse in a little notebook she kept in her apron pocket. Nothing fancy, just observations about the day, about what she saw and felt. He hammered his own nail, the sound echoing across the clearing. I wish I'd paid more attention when she'd read them to me. I'd give anything to remember them now. Maybe some things aren't meant to be remembered word for word, Annie offered. Maybe the feeling of them is enough. Silas considered this, then nodded. Maybe so. They worked in companionable silence for a while longer, and Annie noticed how natural it felt, working alongside him. Their movements complemented each other, anticipating when the other needed a tool or another board. It reminded her of working with Thomas in the early days of their marriage, before grief had taught her how quickly everything could be taken away. That evening, as Annie prepared supper, Silas brought in firewood and began stacking it near the stove. He paused, looking at something on one of the upper shelves, then reached up and brought down 2 small wooden horses, each carved with extraordinary detail. I made these for Daniel, he said, turning them over in his hands. Spent weeks on them, getting the proportions right, making sure they could stand without tipping over. He loved horses. Wanted to be a rancher when he grew up, have 100 horses and ride a different one every day. Annie dried her hands on her apron and came closer to look. The horses were beautiful, clearly made with great care and even greater love. One was rearing up, mane flying, while the other stood steady, head down as if grazing. "They're wonderful," she said softly. He carried them everywhere for months. Slept with them under his pillow, brought them to the table at meals. Clara had to remind him they couldn't eat supper. Silas smiled at the memory, though his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "After he died, I packed them away. Couldn't stand to look at them. But maybe—" He paused, looking at the horses, then at the mantle. "Maybe they should be out. Maybe hiding them away doesn't honor him. Maybe it just makes it like he was never here at all." Annie watched as Silas walked to the mantle and carefully placed the 2 horses next to the photograph and the wooden box. They looked right there, like they'd found their proper home. "He was here," Annie said, "and he was loved. That's what matters." "Yeah," Silas said quietly. "That's what matters." Over the following days, Annie noticed more changes. Silas began opening up in small ways, sharing memories of Clara and Daniel without the crushing weight of grief that had accompanied his words before. He laughed occasionally, not often and never loudly, but it was there. A quiet chuckle when Annie burned a batch of biscuits. A genuine smile when she managed to chop through a particularly stubborn log on her 3rd try. And Annie found herself laughing too. Something she hadn't done in longer than she cared to admit. There was something freeing about being up here, away from the pitying looks of townspeople who knew her story, away from the constant reminders of everything she'd lost. Here she could just be Annie. Not Annie the widow, not Annie the grieving daughter trying to save her father's failing farm. Just Annie. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Silas asked her about her dreams, the ones she'd had before Thomas died. Before loss had reshaped her understanding of what life could be. "I wanted a family," Annie admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "A home that felt safe, where children could grow up knowing they were loved. I wanted to bake bread and plant gardens and watch seasons change from the same windows year after year. Nothing grand, just stable, rooted, real." "That doesn't sound like nothing," Silas said. "That sounds like everything worth having. What about you? What did you want?" "I had it," he said simply. "A wife I loved, a son who made me laugh every day, work that meant something. I didn't know it at the time, but I had everything. Thought it would last forever." He poked at the fire with an iron poker, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. "Now I don't know what I want. Some days I'm just trying to figure out how to keep breathing." "I know that feeling," Annie said. "Some days the best you can do is make it to nightfall. And then you wake up and do it again. Is that enough? Just making it through?" Annie thought about this for a long moment. "I don't know. Maybe it has to be for now. Maybe eventually it becomes something more. But maybe for now, surviving is enough." They sat in silence, watching the fire. Annie was acutely aware of how close they were sitting, how she could feel the warmth radiating from Silas's body, how their shoulders almost touched. It would be so easy to lean into him, to seek comfort in another person's presence. But she held herself still. She'd come here for work. She'd made that clear from the beginning. Getting tangled up in feelings, that wasn't part of the arrangement. But as she climbed the ladder to the loft that night, she couldn't help but wonder if the boundaries she'd set were starting to blur. And if that scared her or thrilled her, she honestly couldn't say. The next morning brought a letter delivered by the mail carrier who made the long trek up the mountain once a week. Silas opened it at the table, read it quickly, and his expression darkened. "What is it?" Annie asked. "Bank," he said tersely. "They're saying I'm 3 months behind on property taxes. Threatening to foreclose if I don't pay by spring," and he felt her stomach drop. "How much do they want?" He named a sum that made her wince. It wasn't a fortune. But for a man living alone on a mountain, scraping by on hunting and trapping, it might as well have been. "I've been so—" He stopped, rubbed a hand over his face. "I haven't been paying attention. Since Clara and Daniel died, I've just been existing, not really living. Let things slide that shouldn't have slid. Can you pay it?" Annie asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Not all at once. Maybe over time, if they'll let me. But banks aren't known for their patience." Annie's mind raced. This was more than just Silas losing his home. If he lost this land, where would he go? And what would happen to her? She'd left her father's farm to come here, had promised herself she'd earn enough to help him. If she had to go back empty-handed, if the farm failed because she hadn't been able to help, we'll figure it out, she said, with more confidence than she felt. There has to be a way. Silas looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. We, Annie hesitated, then nodded. I'm here, aren't I? Might as well help if I can. For a moment she thought he might argue, might retreat into that proud independence that kept most people at arm's length. But instead he just nodded slowly. All right then, he said. We'll figure it out together. And there it was again, that word, together. It hung in the air between them, meaning more than it should, promising more than either of them was ready to acknowledge. But the threat was real, and the deadline was approaching. They had until spring to find a solution, or Silas would lose everything he had left of the life he'd built with Clara and Daniel. Annie looked out the window at the mountain rising above them, at the trees heavy with snow, at the vast expanse of wilderness that both sheltered and isolated them. She'd come here looking for work, for a way to survive. But somewhere along the way, this had become about more than just survival. It had become about protecting something worth saving, and maybe, just maybe, about protecting someone worth saving too. The first real snow came 3 days after the letter from the bank. Annie woke to a world transformed. Everything outside the window covered in white, so pure it almost hurt to look at. The trees wore thick coats of snow on their branches, and the clearing in front of the cabin looked like something from a storybook, untouched, pristine, beautiful in its stillness. When she climbed down from the loft, she found Silas already awake, standing at the window with a cup of coffee in his hands. He'd set out the second cup as usual, and for once, Annie found herself reaching for it. The gesture felt significant somehow, like crossing an invisible line they'd both been careful not to approach. "Roads'll be impassable for weeks now," Silas said without turning around. "We're cut off until the thaw." Annie wrapped her hands around the warm cup, grateful for the heat. "Does that bother you?" "No, used to in the beginning. Felt trapped up here. Now it just feels safe, I guess. Like the world can't reach me as long as the snow keeps falling." Annie understood that feeling. The mountain had become a kind of sanctuary for her, too. A place where the past couldn't quite catch up, and the future didn't demand immediate answers. But she also knew that isolation could become its own kind of trap if you weren't careful. As the morning wore on, the temperature in the cabin dropped despite the fire blazing in the hearth. Annie found herself shivering as she worked, her fingers clumsy with cold. Silas noticed, and without a word disappeared into his room. When he returned, he carried a shawl, deep burgundy wool, soft from years of wear. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. It was Clara's. She'd want it used, not just folded away in a trunk. Annie hesitated, her fingers hovering over the fabric. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. It's just cloth. And cloth is meant to keep people warm, not gather dust." But they both knew it was more than just cloth. It was a gesture of trust, of inclusion, of allowing someone new into the spaces where Clara's memories still lived. Annie took the shawl carefully and draped it around her shoulders. It smelled faintly of cedar and lavender, and the warmth was immediate. "Thank you," she said softly. Silas nodded and turned back to his work. But Annie caught the faintest hint of a smile on his face. That evening, they sat by the fire, as had become their habit, and Silas began to tell her stories about his childhood in these mountains, about his father teaching him to hunt and trap, about the hard winters when game was scarce, and they had to make do with what they could forage or preserve. He spoke about Clara too, about how they'd met in Timber Ridge when they were barely more than children, how he'd known from the first moment he saw her that she was the one he'd spend his life with. "Did you feel that way about your husband?" Silas asked. "That knowing?" Annie considered the question. "I thought I did at the time. Thomas was kind and steady, and my father approved of him. It felt right. Like it was what I was supposed to do. But I was so young, barely 19 when we married. I'm not sure I really knew what love was yet. And now, do you know?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't know. Maybe love is different for everyone. Maybe for some people it's lightning, and for others it's something that grows slow and steady, like a tree. Clara was lightning for me, Silas said. Knocked me sideways the first time I saw her. But what we built together over the years, that was the tree. The roots that go deep and hold strong, even when the storms come. He paused. Except the storm that took her was stronger than any roots could hold against. Annie pulled the shawl tighter around herself. I think maybe both kinds of love can exist at once. The lightning that starts it and the roots that sustain it, maybe so. They fell into silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Annie found herself studying Silas in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands rested loosely on his knees, the small scars that marked his fingers from years of working with tools and traps. He was handsome in a rugged, weathered way, but that wasn't what drew her. It was the quiet strength he carried, the way he'd survived something that would have broken a lesser man. She realized with a start that she was thinking about him in ways she'd promised herself she wouldn't. This was work. She reminded herself, just work. She was here to earn wages and help her father, not to develop feelings for a man still in love with his dead wife. But even as she thought it, she knew it was already too late. Something had taken root between them, whether she wanted it to or not. Over the next few days, the snow continued to fall, and the cabin became their entire world. They worked together with an ease that felt natural. Annie cooking while Silas brought in firewood, both of them mending clothes by the fire in the evenings, sharing stories and comfortable silences in equal measure. One night, Silas reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. It wasn't romantic exactly, more like a gesture of connection, of acknowledging that they weren't alone in their grief anymore. Annie's heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't pull away. She let her fingers curl around his, let herself feel the warmth and strength of another person's touch. They sat that way until the fire burned low, neither speaking, just being together in the quiet. And when Annie finally climbed to the loft, she lay awake for a long time, her hand still tingling where his had been, her mind spinning with questions she wasn't ready to answer. The next morning brought another letter from the bank, this one more insistent. The deadline was firm, payment in full by March 1st, or the property would be seized. Silas read it with a grim expression, then crumpled it in his fist. There has to be something we can do, Annie said. Some way to earn the money or negotiate more time? Banks don't negotiate, Silas said bitterly. They just take. But Annie refused to accept defeat. She'd survived loss, survived grief, survived the slow dissolution of everything she'd thought her life would be. She could survive this too. They both could. She just had to figure out how. She spent the afternoon going through Silas's papers, looking for anything that might help. Old contracts, property deeds, anything that might give them leverage. And in the back of a drawer, beneath stacks of old receipts and faded letters, she found something that made her breath catch. But she said nothing about it yet. She needed to be sure, needed to understand what she was looking at before she got Silas's hopes up. That night, lying in her narrow bed with Clara's shawl wrapped around her shoulders, Annie made a decision. She was going to fight for this place, for this man, for the fragile peace they'd both found on this mountain. She'd come here for work. But somewhere along the way, it had become about so much more than that. Annie waited 3 days before telling Silas about what she'd found. She wanted to be certain, wanted to understand the documents fully before raising hopes that might be dashed. During those 3 days, she studied the papers carefully, reading and rereading every word, trying to make sense of legal language that felt designed to confuse rather than clarify. What she'd found was a ledger book, old, leather-bound with pages yellowed by time. It had belonged to Clara, that much was clear from the careful handwriting on the inside cover. But it wasn't just a household ledger. Tucked between pages of grocery lists and recipe notes were pressed flowers, small sketches of the cabin and the mountain, and in the margins, notes written in Silas's hand. Little messages of love and appreciation, scattered throughout the book like hidden treasures. "Your stew was perfect tonight," one note read. almost as perfect as you. Found that blue flower you were looking for. Pressed it for you here. Love you more than words. 10 years married today. Best decision I ever made." Annie felt like an intruder reading these intimate messages, but she couldn't look away. This was love in its most honest form. Not grand gestures or elaborate declarations, but small daily affirmations of devotion. The kind of love that Thomas had never quite managed. That Annie had never quite believed possible until she saw it written here in fading ink. But it was what she found tucked into the back of the ledger that changed everything. A set of documents. Property papers, by the look of them, but older than the ones the bank was using to threaten foreclosure. These showed the original purchase of the land by Silas's father, Jonas Boone, back in 1867, and according to these papers, the property had been paid in full, with no mortgages, no liens, nothing that would give the bank any legal claim. There was also a letter, dated 20 years ago, from a lawyer in Cheyenne. It referenced a clerical error in the land office records, something about the property transfer not being properly recorded when Jonas Boone died and left everything to Silas. The letter promised to rectify the situation, but there was no follow-up, no confirmation that the issue had ever been resolved. Annie's hands trembled as she read. If the original transfer was never properly recorded, if there was confusion about who actually owned the land, then maybe, just maybe, the bank's claim was invalid. On the fourth morning, she brought the ledger to breakfast and set it on the table in front of Silas. "What's this?" he asked, looking at it with confusion and something that might have been pain. "It's Clara's garden journal. I found it while I was looking through your papers for anything that might help with the bank situation. I'm sorry, I know I shouldn't have read it, but Silas, there's something in here you need to see." She opened to the back pages and showed him the documents. Silas read slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to surprise to something that looked almost like hope. "My father's deed," he said quietly. "I didn't know Clara had kept this. There's more. This letter from the lawyer. It says there was a problem with the property transfer when your father died. It was never properly recorded at the land office. If that's true, if the transfer is still unresolved, then the bank might not have legal grounds to foreclose." Silas looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw a war between hope and the fear of hoping. That was 20 years ago. Surely it's been sorted out by now, but what if it hasn't? What if this is still sitting in some clerk's filing cabinet in Cheyenne, never resolved? It's worth checking, isn't it? It's worth fighting for. Fighting how? "I can't afford a lawyer. Can barely afford to keep the lights on as it is." Annie had thought about this. "We go to Cheyenne ourselves. We take these documents to the land office, see what they have on record. If there's a discrepancy, if there's any question about the bank's claim, maybe we can buy time. Maybe we can find a way to make this right. That's a long shot, Annie, and Cheyenne's a week's journey, even in good weather. We'd need money for the trip, for a place to stay, for—" "I have some money saved," Annie interrupted. "Not much, but enough for train tickets and a few nights in a boarding house. And if we're careful, if we do this right, it might be the solution we need." Silas stared at the documents for a long moment, then at Annie. "Why would you do this? Risk your savings? Spend your time on something that might not even work? This isn't your fight." Annie met his gaze steadily. "Isn't it? I live here too. I work here. And besides—" She paused, trying to find the right words. "I've spent 3 years just surviving, Silas. Just getting from one day to the next without any real purpose beyond not giving up. This place, helping you fight for it, it feels like something worth doing. Like something that matters." The silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither was quite ready to say. Finally, Silas reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Thank you," he said simply. "I don't deserve your help, but I'm grateful for it." "You do deserve it," Annie said firmly. "You deserve to keep the home you built, the land your family worked, and I'm going to help you do it." They spent the rest of that day and the next organizing the documents, making a list of everything they'd need for the trip to Cheyenne. Annie wrote to her father, explaining that she'd be away for a while longer, but that everything was fine. She didn't mention the real reason for the trip, didn't want to worry him or raise his hopes about the money she'd been sending home. 3 days before they were scheduled to leave, another letter arrived. This one wasn't from the bank. It was from the lawyer Silas had consulted years ago, Mr. Abernathy, now based in Cheyenne. Someone, probably Clara before she died, had kept up occasional correspondence with him. The letter was addressed to Clara, dated 6 months before her death, but it had been stored in the box with the other papers and never opened. Silas opened it now, his hands shaking slightly. As he read, his expression shifted from confusion to understanding, to something that looked like grief mixed with relief. "What does it say?" Annie asked. "He's been trying to resolve the property issue all these years. Says there's definitely a problem with the land records, that the transfer was never completed properly. He was waiting to hear back from the Territorial Land Office when..." Silas's voice broke. "When Clara died, and I never thought to follow up with him. Never even knew there was an ongoing issue. But he's still working on it," Annie said, reading over his shoulder. "Or he was 6 months ago. This is good, Silas. This means we have an advocate, someone who already knows the case, if he's even still practicing. This letter is almost 6 years old. Then we'll go to Cheyenne and find out. If he's there, wonderful. If not, we'll find someone else. But we're not giving up." Silas looked at her for a long moment, then slowly smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and made him look years younger. "You're stubborn, you know that." "I've been told that before," Annie admitted, smiling back. That evening, as they sat by the fire making final preparations for the journey, Silas told her more about his father. About Jonas Boone, who'd come west after the war, determined to build something lasting in a land that promised new beginnings. About how he'd chosen this spot for its beauty and its isolation, had built the cabin with his own hands, log by log. About how he'd always said the land would be in the family forever, passed down through generations. He used to carve these little notches in the porch railing, Silas said, running his hand along the wood. "One for every good thing that happened, a successful hunt, a mild winter, the day I was born. There must be 100 of them by now. Did you add to them?" Annie asked. "After he died, I did. Carved one the day I married Clara, another when Daniel was born. Haven't carved one since..." He stopped, swallowed hard. "Haven't had a reason to, I guess." Annie thought about this. About how we mark our joy, how we measure our lives. About how grief can make us forget that there are still moments worth marking. Still reasons to hope. "Maybe when we win this fight," she said carefully. "Maybe that would be worth a notch." Silas looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she couldn't quite name. "Maybe it would," he agreed quietly. "Maybe it would." Later, when Annie climbed to the loft, she found herself unable to sleep. She kept thinking about the journey ahead, about the risk they were taking, about what it would mean if they failed. But more than that, she thought about what it would mean if they succeeded. If Silas kept his land, if she stayed on as his housekeeper or as something more, because somewhere along the way the boundaries she'd so carefully set had dissolved. She cared about Silas, cared about what happened to him in a way that went far beyond employer and employee. And she was almost certain he felt the same way about her, but neither of them had said it aloud. Neither had been brave enough to put words to the thing growing between them, and maybe that was for the best. Maybe some things were better left unspoken until the time was right. But as Annie finally drifted off to sleep, wrapped in Clara's shawl, she knew the time was coming when silence wouldn't be enough anymore. When they'd have to decide what they meant to each other and what kind of future, if any, they wanted to build together. The morning they left for Timber Ridge to catch the train to Cheyenne. The air was crisp and cold, but the sky was clear. A good omen, Annie hoped, though she'd never been particularly superstitious. Silas loaded their bags onto the sled he used for hauling supplies, and they made their way down the mountain path together, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air. The descent took most of the morning. Annie found herself looking back more than once, watching the cabin grow smaller in the distance until it disappeared entirely behind the trees. It surprised her how much the sight affected her, as if she were leaving home rather than just taking a temporary trip. When had this place become home? When had she stopped thinking of her father's farm as where she belonged? They reached Timber Ridge in early afternoon. The town was exactly as Annie remembered it from her supply runs. A single main street, lined with shops and businesses, a church with a white steeple, houses spreading out in neat rows. People stopped and stared as she and Silas made their way toward the train station, whispers following in their wake. "That's him," Annie heard someone mutter. The mountain man. "Crazy as they come, and that's the Boyd girl. Shame what she's gotten herself into." Annie lifted her chin and kept walking. Let them talk. She knew the truth, and that was all that mattered. At the general store, they ran into Mr. Garrett, the banker who'd sent the threatening letters. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Boone," he said, his tone dripping with false courtesy. "I trust you've come to settle your debt?" "We're working on it," Silas said evenly. "Working on it isn't the same as paying it." "The deadline stands, Mr. Boone, March 1st, not a day later. We understand the terms," Annie said, stepping forward. "And we'll meet them." Garrett's gaze shifted to her, and his smile turned condescending. "Miss Boyd, I'd heard you were keeping house for Mr. Boone. I do hope you're being paid regularly, given his financial difficulties." "My employment is none of your concern," Annie replied coolly. "And neither is how we choose to handle our business." "Our business?" Garrett raised an eyebrow. "How interesting. Well, I suppose it's your prerogative to align yourself with a lost cause. Just don't say you weren't warned." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Annie furious and Silas looking troubled. "He's trying to rattle us," Annie said. "Don't let him. He's succeeding," Silas admitted. "Part of me wonders if we're just chasing shadows, if this whole trip is a waste of time and money we can't afford to lose." Annie took his arm, a bold gesture in public, but one she felt was necessary. "We're not chasing shadows. We're fighting for what's yours. And we're not going to let men like Garrett win just because they think they can bully us into giving up." Something in Silas's expression softened. "You're fierce when you're angry, you know that." "Good, because I'm planning to be angry until we win this fight." The train arrived an hour later, belching steam and smoke as it pulled into the station. They found seats in a modest car, settling in for the long journey ahead. As the train lurched into motion and Timber Ridge disappeared behind them, Annie felt a strange mix of apprehension and excitement. She'd never been this far from home before, never ventured beyond the small world of her father's farm and the mountain cabin. The landscape changed as they traveled, mountains giving way to rolling plains, pine forests to open grassland. Silas sat by the window watching the scenery pass, and Annie found herself watching him instead. The way the light caught in his hair, the strong line of his profile, the slight furrow between his brows that suggested he was deep in thought. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Clara," he admitted. "We talked about taking a trip once, seeing Cheyenne and maybe even Denver. But there was always something that needed doing. The farm, Daniel's schooling, one thing or another. We kept saying we'd go someday, but someday never came. I'm sorry. Don't be. I'm learning that regret doesn't change anything. All we have is now, and the choices we make going forward." He turned to look at her. "I'm glad you're here, Annie. I don't think I could do this alone." "You could," Annie said. "But you don't have to." They shared a meal from the basket Annie had packed, bread and cheese and dried apples. As evening fell and the other passengers began to doze, they talked in low voices about everything and nothing. About books they'd read, places they'd like to see, what they'd do with the cabin if they managed to save it. "I'd like to fix up Daniel's room," Silas said. "Maybe turn it into a proper guest room. Or," he paused, seeming uncertain, "or maybe a nursery someday if—" He stopped, as if realizing what he'd implied. Annie's heart hammered in her chest. "If what?" Silas met her eyes, and in his gaze she saw vulnerability and hope tangled together. "If life gave me another chance at that kind of happiness. I don't know if I deserve it, but I'd like to think it's possible. Everyone deserves another chance. Annie said softly. Especially people who've loved deeply and lost. They fell into silence, but Silas reached across the space between them and took her hand. Annie let him, intertwining her fingers with his. It felt natural, right? Like they'd been doing this for years instead of weeks. That night, in separate rooms at a modest boarding house in Cheyenne, Annie lay awake thinking about what Silas had said. About second chances and the possibility of happiness. About whether she was brave enough to reach for what she wanted instead of just settling for what seemed safe. She'd told Silas she came to the mountain for work, nothing more. But that had been a lie, or at least a partial truth. She'd come looking for a reason to keep going, for something to make her feel alive again after years of just existing, and she'd found it. Not in the work itself, but in the quiet man who carved wooden horses for a son who would never play with them again. In the strength it took to keep living when everything you loved had been taken away. In the possibility that two broken people might somehow make each other whole. Tomorrow they'd go to the land office and begin their fight. But tonight, Annie let herself imagine a future that went beyond just saving the cabin. A future where she and Silas carved their own notches in the porch railing, marking moments of joy they'd create together. It was a dangerous hope. But maybe, just maybe, it was one worth holding on to. The Wyoming Territorial Land Office was housed in a brick building on 3rd Street. Its windows tall and narrow, its interior dim, even in the morning light. Annie and Silas climbed the steps together, the weight of the documents heavy in the leather satchel Silas carried. This was it, the moment that would determine whether their hope had any foundation or whether they were just two people chasing an impossible dream. A clerk sat behind a high desk, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose, his expression one of perpetual boredom. When Silas explained what they needed, the man sighed as if they'd asked him to move a mountain. Property records from 1867. That's 40 years back. Those files are in the basement, and I'm not authorized to retrieve them without proper documentation. You'll need to file a formal request, pay the research fee, and wait 3 to 6 weeks for processing. 3 to 6 weeks, Annie repeated, her voice rising despite her best efforts to stay calm. We don't have that kind of time. The bank is threatening foreclosure in less than 2 months, the clerk shrugged. Not my problem, miss. Rules are rules. Silas's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, a door at the back of the office opened, and an older gentleman emerged. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard, dressed in a suit that spoke of both means and taste. Did I hear someone mention a foreclosure issue? He asked, his voice warm and curious. The clerk straightened in his chair. Yes, Mr. Abernathy. These people are asking about old property records. I was just explaining our procedures, Abernathy. Annie's breath caught. This was the lawyer who'd been corresponding with Clara, the one who'd been trying to resolve the property issue all those years ago. Mr. Abernathy, Silas said, stepping forward. I'm Silas Boone. I think you knew my wife, Clara. The older man's expression shifted immediately from polite interest to genuine surprise and then sadness. Clara Boone, yes, I knew her. A remarkable woman. I was deeply sorry to hear of her passing. And your son as well. My condolences, Mr. Boone, thank you, Silas said quietly. We found some letters you'd written to Clara about a problem with our property records. We were hoping you might still remember the case. Abernathy's eyes lit up. Remember it? I've been trying to resolve that issue for 20 years. Come with me, both of you. We need to talk. He led them to his office, a room lined with law books and filing cabinets, and gestured for them to sit. Annie perched on the edge of her chair, her heart pounding with hope and anxiety in equal measure. The Boone property, Abernathy said, pulling a file from his cabinet with practiced ease. I've kept this case active, even after Clara stopped responding to my letters. I suspected something had happened, but I had no way of knowing what. When the property transfer from your father to you was supposed to be recorded in 1885, there was a clerical error. The papers were misfiled, and the transfer was never officially completed. As far as the territorial records are concerned, the property still belongs to Jonas Boone, who has been deceased for 20 years. So who actually owns the land? Annie asked. That's the question, isn't it? Legally, it should be Silas. He's the rightful heir, and there's no dispute about that. But without the proper paperwork on file, the chain of ownership is murky. And when chains of ownership are murky, opportunistic parties, like banks, can sometimes exploit the confusion, so the bank's claim might be invalid. Silas leaned forward, hope evident in his voice. It might be. But proving that will require a court hearing and a proper adjudication. I've been waiting for the right moment to push this case forward, but without a plaintiff actively pursuing it, I couldn't proceed. Now that you're here, Mr. Boone, we can finally take action. What would that entail? Annie asked. We'd need to file a petition with the territorial court, present the evidence of the original deed and your father's will, and argue that the bank's lien is based on faulty property records. If we can prove the transfer was never completed due to clerical error and that you are the rightful owner, the court may void the bank's claim entirely. It was almost too much to hope for. Annie saw the same thought reflected in Silas's eyes, the fear that this was too good to be true, that something would go wrong at the last moment. How long would a court case take? Silas asked. If we move quickly, we could have a hearing within 2 weeks. The territory is trying to modernize its legal processes, and property disputes are being fast-tracked. But I won't lie to you, it's not a guaranteed win. The bank will fight hard, and they have resources we don't. But we have the truth, Annie said firmly. That has to count for something. Abernathy smiled at her. The truth is a powerful thing, young lady. Let's see if we can make it powerful enough. They spent the rest of the morning going through documents with Abernathy, building their case piece by piece. The lawyer was thorough and encouraging, and for the first time since they'd started this journey, Annie felt like they might actually have a chance. As they were preparing to leave, Abernathy reached into his desk and pulled out an envelope. Before you go, there's something else. Clara gave this to me during our last meeting, about a week before she passed. She asked me to keep it sealed and to give it to you, Silas, if you ever came to see me about the property. She said you'd know when the time was right. Silas took the envelope with trembling hands. His name was written on the front in Clara's careful script. He stared at it for a long moment, then tucked it into his coat pocket. Thank you, he managed. They left the office in a daze, the cold Cheyenne air a shock after the warmth of Abernathy's office. They walked in silence for a while, both processing everything they'd learned. Finally, they found a small park and sat on a bench, watching people pass by on the street. Are you going to read it? Annie asked, nodding at the envelope in Silas's pocket. I don't know if I can. Not yet. Would you like me to leave you alone? No. Silas reached for her hand. Stay, please. They sat in silence for a few more minutes. Then, with a deep breath, Silas pulled out the envelope and carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Clara's handwriting. His hands shook as he read, and Annie saw tears begin to slide down his cheeks. She knew, he whispered. She knew she was dying, and she wrote this. What does it say? Annie asked gently. Silas handed her the letter, unable to speak. Annie read the words Clara had written all those years ago. My dearest Silas, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've finally taken the step I've been praying you would take, fighting for the life and home we built together. I know grief will try to swallow you whole. I know you'll want to disappear into the mountain and never come back. But please, my love, don't let grief make you forget how to live. You have so much love left to give, so many years ahead of you. Don't waste them in solitude. Daniel and I will always be with you, but we don't want to be the reason you stop reaching for joy. Find someone who makes you laugh again. Find someone who sees the good man you are, not just the broken one you think you've become. Build a new life while honoring the old one. And most importantly, remember that loving again isn't betraying what we had. It's continuing it in a different form. I want you to be happy, Silas. That's all I've ever wanted. With all my love, always, Clara. Annie's vision blurred with tears. She looked at Silas, who was openly weeping now, and without thinking, she wrapped her arms around him. He held onto her like a drowning man holds a rope, his shoulders shaking with the force of his grief and relief and the weight of permission he'd been waiting years to receive. They stayed that way for a long time, two people holding each other in a park in Cheyenne, while the world moved around them and the past finally began to loosen its grip. When Silas finally pulled back, he wiped his eyes and looked at Annie with an expression she'd never seen before, open, vulnerable, and full of something that looked like hope. "I came to this mountain to hide," he said, "to disappear into my grief and never have to face the world again. And then you showed up with your rules about work and no nonsense, and you—" He stopped, searching for words. "You made me want to live again, made me remember that life is worth living even after loss." Annie's heart was beating so hard she thought it might break through her chest. "Silas, let me finish," he said, taking both her hands in his. "I know you said you weren't here for love, and I respected that. I tried to keep my distance, tried not to feel things I had no right to feel. But Annie, I failed spectacularly at that. Somewhere between the first burned biscuit and this moment right here, I fell in love with you. And I know it's too soon. I know we're in the middle of fighting for my land. I know the timing is all wrong. But Clara's letter, it made me realize I can't keep hiding from what I feel. Life's too short and too uncertain to waste it pretending." Annie felt tears streaming down her own face now. All her carefully constructed walls, all her rules about keeping things professional, all her fear of loving and losing again, it all crumbled in the face of this honest, brave declaration. "I lied," she said, her voice breaking. "When I said I was just there for work, I was lying to you and to myself. I was terrified of feeling anything for anyone ever again, terrified of opening my heart and having it broken. But you—" she squeezed his hands, "you made it impossible not to feel, not to hope, not to imagine a future that looks nothing like the past, but might somehow be even better. So you're saying—" "I'm saying I love you too, Silas Boone. I'm saying I want to fight for this land, yes, but I also want to fight for us, for whatever life we can build together." The kiss, when it came, was gentle and tentative at first, two people learning how to trust again, how to reach for happiness without fear of it being snatched away. But it deepened, became more certain, a promise without words that they were in this together. Whatever came next, when they finally pulled apart, both were breathless and smiling. And Annie realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this light, this free, this full of possibility. "So what now?" she asked. Silas smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face. "Now we go back to the boarding house and celebrate the fact that we have a fighting chance. And tomorrow we start building our case. And after that—" he paused, tucking a strand of her hair behind her ear. "After that we go home. Together." "Together," Annie agreed, and the word had never sounded sweeter. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Abernathy was true to his word, working tirelessly to build their case and expedite the court hearing. He gathered depositions from town officials in Timber Ridge who remembered Jonas Boone, tracked down the original surveyor's records from 1867, and compiled a mountain of evidence that proved beyond doubt that Silas was the rightful owner of the property. Annie and Silas spent their days helping however they could, running errands, organizing documents, and going over their testimony with Abernathy until they could recite the facts in their sleep. But they also found time for themselves, for quiet moments stolen between the chaos of preparation. They walked through Cheyenne together, discovering the city's rhythms and routines. They ate meals in small restaurants where no one knew their story, where they could just be two people enjoying each other's company. They talked about everything, their childhoods, their dreams, the small daily details that make up a life. And slowly, carefully, they began to imagine what their future might look like if everything went according to plan. "I want to expand the cabin," Silas said one evening as they sat on the porch of their boarding house, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. "Add a proper addition, maybe with a sitting room and a larger kitchen. Clara always wanted more space for when we had guests." "That sounds lovely," Annie said, leaning against his shoulder. "And we should fix up the barn too. Maybe get some chickens, a milk cow. Make the place more of a working homestead." "We," Silas repeated, his arm tightening around her. "I like the sound of that," Annie smiled. "So do I." The night before the hearing, neither of them could sleep. They sat up in the boarding house parlor, the only ones awake at that late hour, and talked in low voices about their fears and hopes. "What if we lose?" Silas asked, voicing the worry that had been haunting both of them. "What if the judge rules in favor of the bank?" "Then we'll figure something else out," Annie said firmly. "We'll appeal, or we'll find another way to raise the money, or I don't know, but we won't give up. Not now, not after coming this far. I've been thinking," Silas said slowly. "If we do lose the land, if we have to leave the cabin, I want you to know that it's not about the place anymore. It's about us. I'd live anywhere as long as you were there with me." Annie felt tears prick her eyes. "Don't say that like we've already lost. We haven't even fought yet." "I know, but I needed you to know. The cabin, the land, it's important. It's my family's legacy. But you're my future, Annie, and I won't lose sight of that, no matter what happens tomorrow." They held each other in the quiet parlor, drawing strength from each other, until the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows. The courthouse was an imposing building of gray stone, its columns tall and intimidating. Annie felt small as they climbed the steps, Silas's hand firm in hers. Abernathy met them at the entrance, looking confident and professional in his court attire. "Are you ready?" he asked. "As ready as we'll ever be," Silas replied. The courtroom was already filling with people, curious townspeople, legal clerks, and sitting at the plaintiff's table, representatives from the bank, led by a sharp-featured lawyer who looked like he'd never lost a case in his life. Mr. Garrett was there too, his expression smug and confident. Annie and Silas took their seats behind Abernathy's table, and Annie tried to calm her racing heart. Everything they'd worked for, everything they'd hoped for, came down to this moment. The judge entered, an older man with kind eyes and a stern demeanor. The bailiff called the court to order, and the hearing began. The bank's lawyer went first, laying out their case with precision and confidence. He argued that Silas had failed to pay his property taxes for multiple quarters, that the debt was substantial and undisputed, and that foreclosure was the only reasonable remedy. He presented documents showing the missed payments, the notices sent, the legal process followed to the letter. It was damning testimony, and Annie felt her stomach clench with worry. But Abernathy remained calm, taking notes and occasionally whispering to Silas. When it was their turn, Abernathy stood and addressed the court with the measured confidence of a man who knew his case inside and out. He explained the history of the property, Jonas Boone's original purchase, and the clerical error that had never been corrected. He presented the original deed, the surveyor's maps, Jonas's will, and most importantly, the lawyer's correspondence showing that the issue had been known about for 20 years, but never resolved. "Your Honor," Abernathy said, his voice carrying through the courtroom, "the bank is attempting to foreclose on property that, according to official territorial records, doesn't legally belong to my client. The chain of title is broken due to a clerical error that occurred in 1885. Until that error is corrected, any lien placed on the property is invalid," the bank's lawyer objected strenuously, arguing that the tax obligations existed regardless of title issues. But Abernathy was prepared, citing case law and precedent that supported their position. Then it was time for testimony. Silas took the stand, his voice steady as he explained his family's history on the land. He spoke about his father building the cabin with his own hands, about growing up in those mountains, about marrying Clara and raising Daniel there. He spoke about the loss of his wife and son, and how he'd retreated into grief so completely that he'd let important matters slide. "I take full responsibility for not staying on top of the paperwork," Silas said. "But that land is my family's legacy. 3 generations of Boones have worked that soil, and I'm asking for the chance to continue that legacy." When it was Annie's turn, she testified about finding the documents in Clara's ledger, about their journey to Cheyenne, about why they were fighting so hard for this land. The bank's lawyer tried to rattle her with questions about her relationship with Silas, implying impropriety, but Annie held her ground. "I came to Mr. Boone's cabin as his housekeeper," she said clearly. "But I stayed because I found something worth staying for. A good man who'd suffered terrible loss but was still trying to live with honor and dignity. And a home that deserved to be preserved, not seized by people who care nothing for its history or meaning. She saw several people in the courtroom nodding, and even the judge looked moved by her words. The bank's lawyer called Garrett to the stand, and he testified about the bank's attempts to work with Silas, about the multiple notices sent, the patience they'd shown. But under Abernathy's cross-examination, Garrett's polished demeanor began to crack. He admitted that the bank had been eager to acquire the property due to its valuable timber rights, that they'd been less patient than they might have been with other debtors. "So you saw an opportunity," Abernathy said, "to acquire valuable property at a fraction of its worth by exploiting a man in grief." Objection. The bank's lawyer shouted. "Sustained," the judge said. "Mr. Abernathy, please rephrase. Did the bank consider the extenuating circumstances of Mr. Boone's situation when determining how aggressively to pursue foreclosure?" Garrett hesitated, then admitted, "We followed standard procedures for all delinquent accounts, standard procedures that just happened to work in the bank's financial favor." The objection was sustained again, but the point had been made. The bank wasn't just collecting a debt, they were profiting from a man's tragedy. As the day wore on, both sides presented closing arguments. The bank's lawyer maintained that the tax debt was real and must be paid, regardless of title issues. Abernathy argued that the bank's claim was legally dubious, and that Silas deserved the opportunity to clear the title before any foreclosure could proceed. Finally, after what felt like hours, the judge called for a recess to review the evidence. Annie and Silas waited in the hallway outside the courtroom, too nervous to sit, too anxious to do anything but pace and hold each other's hands. "Whatever happens," Silas said quietly, "thank you for believing in this fight, for standing with me, for everything." "We're not done yet," Annie said, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. Abernathy joined them, looking cautiously optimistic. "I think we made a strong case." The judge seemed receptive to our arguments about the title issue. "But it's impossible to predict which way he'll rule." 20 minutes later, the bailiff called them back into the courtroom. The judge had reached his decision. Annie's heart pounded so hard she could barely hear as the judge began to speak. He reviewed the case methodically, outlining both sides' arguments, acknowledging the complexity of the situation. "This is an unusual case," the judge said, his voice grave. "On one hand, we have a legitimate tax debt that has gone unpaid. On the other, we have a serious question about the validity of the bank's lien, given the unresolved title issue." He paused, looking at both tables, and Annie held her breath. "After reviewing all the evidence, I find that the plaintiff's case has merit. The clerical error of 1885 must be addressed before any foreclosure can proceed. Therefore, I am ruling in favor of Mr. Boone. The foreclosure is hereby suspended pending resolution of the title issue." Relief flooded through Annie so powerfully she felt dizzy. Silas grabbed her hand, his grip almost painful in its intensity, but the judge wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "the tax debt remains a valid obligation. Mr. Boone, you will have 6 months to clear the title and pay the outstanding taxes, plus a reduced penalty given the circumstances. If you fail to meet this deadline, the foreclosure proceedings will resume. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge nodded and brought his gavel down with a resounding crack. "This court is adjourned." For a moment, Annie couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at Silas in disbelief. They'd won. Not completely. They still had to pay the debt, but they'd won the most important battle. The land was still his, and they had time to figure out the rest. Then Silas pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. And neither of them cared that they were in a public courtroom with dozens of witnesses. They'd fought for this, and they'd won. And nothing else mattered in that moment. Abernathy was smiling broadly, shaking Silas's hand, explaining next steps about clearing the title and setting up a payment plan. People were congratulating them, patting Silas on the back. telling them they'd always known the bank was overreaching. Even some of the townspeople from Timber Ridge, who'd whispered about Silas being crazy or dangerous, were now coming forward to shake his hand, to tell him they were glad justice had been served. Through it all, Annie held on to Silas and he held on to her, and they both knew that this victory was about more than just land or money or legal battles. It was about refusing to give up, about fighting for what mattered, about finding the courage to hope even when hope seemed foolish. That evening, as they celebrated with Abernathy over a modest dinner, Annie looked at Silas and saw not the broken, grieving man she'd met months ago, but someone transformed by the possibility of a future worth building. And she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, and there would be challenges, there always were, they would face them together. The journey wasn't over. They still had 6 months to clear the debt, still had to return to the mountain and figure out how to raise the money. But for the first time since Annie had climbed up that mountain path with her small canvas bag and her carefully guarded heart, she felt like the impossible might actually be possible. She'd come looking for work, but she'd found so much more, a home, a purpose, and a love she'd stopped believing existed, and that, she thought as Silas smiled at her across the table, his eyes bright with hope and joy, was worth fighting for. The return to the mountain felt different than the journey down. Annie and Silas traveled in comfortable silence, both lost in thought about everything that had happened and everything that still needed to be done. They had 6 months to pay the debt, 6 months to find a way to raise money that seemed substantial for 2 people living on the edge of the wilderness. But Annie refused to let doubt creep back in. They'd come too far, fought too hard to give up now. The cabin looked exactly as they'd left it, snow-covered and peaceful, tucked into the mountainside like it had always been there, and always would be. But as Annie stepped inside, something felt different. It wasn't just a place she worked anymore. It was home, her home, their home. Over the next few days, they settled back into their routine, but with a new energy and purpose. They drew up plans, made lists, and strategized about how to raise the money they needed. Silas could sell more timber rights, but carefully, without stripping the land. Annie could expand her preserves and baked goods business, maybe even start taking orders from the hotels in Cheyenne. Every option was considered, every possibility explored. One evening, as they sat by the fire, reviewing their financial calculations for the 100th time, Silas set down his pencil and looked at Annie with an expression she'd come to recognize, the one that meant he had something important to say, but wasn't sure how to begin. "What is it?" she asked. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about us, about what happens after we pay off the debt and the land is truly ours." Annie's heart began to beat faster. "What about it?" "I know we haven't known each other long. A few months isn't much time, not really. But I feel like I've known you longer than that, like I've been waiting for you without even knowing it." He took her hands in his. "Annie Boyd, when this is all settled, when the land is secured and we can breathe again, I want to marry you. If you'll have me." Annie felt tears spring to her eyes. It wasn't a surprise, not really. They'd been building toward this moment since that day in Cheyenne. But hearing him say it, hearing the hope and vulnerability in his voice, made it real in a way that took her breath away. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I'll marry you. I can't think of anything I want more." Silas pulled her into his arms, and they held each other while the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the pines outside. It was a quiet moment, intimate and profound, the kind that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. "I don't have a ring," Silas said, pulling back to look at her. "I gave Clara's to be buried with her, and I wouldn't feel right asking you to wear it anyway." "I don't need a ring," Annie said. "I just need you and this life we're building together." "Still," Silas said, "you deserve something. A symbol, a promise." He stood and walked to the mantel, picking up the small wooden box that had held Clara's letters. He opened it carefully and pulled out a thin gold chain with a small pendant, a delicate carving of a pine tree, no bigger than a thumbnail. "I made this for Clara years ago, when we were first married. She wore it every day until he stopped, swallowed hard. Before she died, she took it off and put it back in the box. She wrote me a note saying that if I ever found someone else to love, I should give this to her. Not as a replacement, but as a continuation. Clara believed that love didn't end, it just transformed into new shapes. Annie took the necklace with trembling hands, holding it up to the firelight. The carving was exquisite, every needle on the tiny pine tree perfectly rendered. It was a labor of love, and Clara's generosity in offering it to whoever came next took Annie's breath away. "Will you help me put it on?" she asked. Silas fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers gentle on her skin. Annie touched the pendant, feeling the weight of it, not heavy but significant. A bridge between past and future, between grief and hope, between one love and another. "Thank you," she whispered, "for this and for choosing me, and for being brave enough to love again. Thank you for seeing past the broken parts to the man I could be again." They spent that night making plans, not just for how to save the land, but for what their life would look like afterward. They talked about the wedding, simple and small, probably in Timber Ridge's little church. They talked about children, about whether they'd be blessed with a family or if it would just be the two of them, and how either way would be enough. They talked about growing old together, about carving notches in the porch railing for every good thing that happened, about filling the cabin with laughter and warmth and the kind of love that endures. And as Annie finally climbed to the loft that night, she touched the pendant at her throat and thought about Clara's wisdom. Love didn't end, it just transformed. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, it transformed into something even more beautiful than before. The next morning, they woke to find another letter had been slipped under the door. Annie picked it up, frowning. Who would have come all the way up the mountain to deliver a letter? The mail carrier wasn't due for days yet. She opened it, and her blood ran cold as she read the words inside. "Silas," she called, her voice tight with fear. "You need to see this." He came quickly, taking the letter from her shaking hands. As he read, his expression darkened. It was from Garrett and the bank. Despite the court's ruling, they were challenging the decision, claiming new evidence had come to light. They were demanding an immediate payment of the full debt, or they would pursue emergency foreclosure proceedings. "They can't do this," Annie said. "The judge ruled in our favor." "They're trying to bully us," Silas said, his jaw tight. "Hoping we'll give up rather than fight another legal battle." Annie felt rage building in her chest. After everything they'd been through, after the victory they'd won, the bank was still trying to take what didn't belong to them. "What do we do?" she asked. Silas looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the steel that had helped him survive years of grief and isolation. "We fight. We go back to Cheyenne, we talk to Abernathy, and we fight. They're not taking this land, not now, not ever." Annie nodded, feeling her own determination solidify. They'd won once. They could win again. They had to. The telegram to Abernathy was sent that same day, and his response came swiftly. "Don't panic. This is a desperate move. Meet me in Cheyenne as soon as possible." They left the next morning, moving as quickly as the winter conditions would allow. The urgency felt different this time. Not the cautious hope of their first trip, but a fierce determination born of righteous anger. The bank had underestimated them once. They wouldn't get the chance to do it again. Abernathy met them at his office, his expression serious but not defeated. "They're claiming they found a prior lien on the property from 1892, allegedly filed by a creditor of your father's. If it's legitimate, it would supersede the title issue and give them grounds to proceed with foreclosure, regardless of our victory." "My father had no debts," Silas said firmly. "He paid for everything in cash. He didn't believe in borrowing. That's what I suspected. Which means this is almost certainly a fabricated document, or at the very least, a misattributed one. But we need to prove it's false, and we need to do it quickly. How?" Annie asked. Abernathy pulled out a large map of the territory and spread it on his desk. "The lien they're claiming was filed in Carbon County, but your father's property is in Albany County. Even if such a lien existed, it wouldn't apply to land in a different county unless specifically stated. It's a basic legal principle, and the fact that the bank's lawyers are trying this suggests they're grasping at straws. So we just point that out to the judge? It's not quite that simple. We need to retrieve the actual filing from Carbon County records to prove it doesn't reference your father or his property. And we need to do it before the emergency hearing they've requested, which is scheduled for 3 days from now. 3 days. Annie felt the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach, but she pushed it down. They'd faced worse odds and prevailed. They could do it again. I'll go to Carbon County myself, Abernathy said. You two should prepare your testimony. They're going to come at you hard this time, try to rattle you, make you seem unreliable or dishonest. You need to be ready. They spent the next 2 days in intensive preparation. Abernathy drilled them on their testimony, anticipating every possible question the bank's lawyers might ask. Annie practiced staying calm under hostile questioning, practiced not letting anger or fear affect her responses. Silas reviewed every detail of his family's financial history, determined to leave no gaps the bank could exploit. On the morning of the hearing, Abernathy returned from Carbon County with a triumphant gleam in his eye. The lien exists, he said, but it's for a property in Rawlins, not your father's land. It belonged to a Jonas Boone, but a different one, Jonas T. Boone, not Jonas R. Boone. The bank either confused the two or hoped we wouldn't check carefully enough to notice the difference. So it's fraud, Annie said. Attempted fraud, at the very least. And the judge is not going to be pleased. The courtroom was packed for the emergency hearing. Word had spread about the case, and people were curious to see if the bank would succeed in their aggressive tactics, or if the mountain man and his housekeeper would prevail again. The bank's lawyer presented their case with confidence, arguing that the newly discovered lien changed everything. But when it was Abernathy's turn, he methodically dismantled their argument, presenting the actual lien document and highlighting the different middle initial, the different county, the complete lack of any connection to Jonas R. Boone or his property. Your Honor, Abernathy said, his voice ringing with controlled outrage. This is either gross incompetence or deliberate deception on the part of the bank. They have wasted this court's time with a spurious claim based on a document that has no relevance to this case whatsoever. The judge's expression grew increasingly stern as he reviewed the evidence. He questioned the bank's lawyer sharply, asking how such a fundamental error could have occurred. The lawyer stumbled through his explanation, clearly caught off guard by having their bluff called so decisively. Finally, the judge had heard enough. I find the bank's claim to be without merit and their presentation of this evidence to be, at best, careless and at worst, an attempt to manipulate these proceedings. His voice was cold with disapproval. The original ruling stands. Mr. Boone has 6 months to clear the title and pay his debt, and the bank will make no further attempts to interfere with that timeline. Furthermore, given the bank's conduct in this matter, I am reducing the penalty amount by half. If the bank wishes to object, they may file an appeal, but I warn them that I will look very unfavorably on any further frivolous motions. The gavel came down with a resounding crack, and Annie felt something release in her chest, all the tension, all the fear, all the uncertainty that had been building since they received that threatening letter. They'd won. Again. And this time, it was final. Silas pulled her into his arms, right there in the courtroom, and Annie didn't care who was watching. They'd fought for this, had refused to be intimidated or defeated, and they'd prevailed. The land was theirs. The future was theirs. Everything they'd hoped for was finally, truly within reach. As they left the courthouse, Garrett stood on the steps, his expression bitter. You may have won this battle, he said, but you still have to pay that debt. And 6 months isn't as long as you think. Silas paused and looked at him steadily. We'll pay it, every cent, and we'll do it with time to spare. You tried to take something that wasn't yours to take, Mr. Garrett. I hope you've learned something from this. Annie took Silas's arm, and together they walked away from the courthouse. From Garrett, from the fight that had consumed their lives for weeks. They had 6 months to make good on their promise, but for the first time since this all began, Annie believed completely that they would succeed, because they had something the bank didn't have, something money couldn't buy, and legal maneuvering. Who couldn't defeat? They had each other, and they had love, and they had a future worth fighting for. And that, Annie knew in her bones, was more than enough. Summer came to the mountain like a blessing. The snow melted, revealing earth that was ready to be worked, and Annie and Silas threw themselves into making good on their promise. They sold. Timber Wrights carefully worked odd jobs in town, and Annie's preserves and baked goods business flourished beyond anything she'd imagined. Word spread about the mountain woman who made the best blackberry jam in Wyoming, and orders came in faster than she could fill them. Silas took work as a hunting guide for wealthy tourists from back east, using his knowledge of the mountains to earn wages that steadily chipped away at the debt. It was hard work, long hours, and there were days when they both collapsed into bed exhausted, but they were doing it. Together, they were making it happen. By late August, they'd paid off the entire debt. Annie would never forget the moment they walked into the Timber Ridge Bank and handed over the final payment to a stone-faced Mr. Garrett. He counted the money twice, as if hoping to find a shortage, but there was none. They'd paid every cent, and they'd done it with a month to spare. "The debt is settled," Garrett said stiffly, sliding a receipt across the counter. "The property is yours, free and clear." Silas took the receipt and folded it carefully. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Garrett. We won't be needing your services again." As they left the bank, Annie felt lighter than she had in years, maybe lighter than she'd ever felt. The fight was over. The land was saved. Their future was secured. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in Timber Ridge's small church. It was a simple ceremony, attended by townspeople who'd come to respect Silas and Annie's determination, by her father, who wept with joy at seeing his daughter so happy, and by Mr. Abernathy, who'd traveled from Cheyenne to serve as a witness. Annie wore a simple dress of cream-colored linen that she'd sewn herself, and around her neck hung Clara's pine tree pendant. Silas wore his best suit, looking uncomfortable in the formal clothing, but unable to stop smiling, as Annie walked down the aisle toward him. The vows they spoke were traditional, but the meaning behind them was anything but. These were two people who'd known profound loss, who'd survived grief that might have destroyed lesser souls, who'd found each other against all odds and chosen to be brave enough to love again. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Silas kissed her, Annie felt something click into place, a sense of rightness, of completion, of coming home to a place she hadn't known she was searching for. The celebration that followed was joyful and warm. People who'd once whispered that Silas Boone was half wild and dangerous now toasted his health and happiness. Annie's father, who'd been so worried about his daughter going to work for a stranger on a mountain, embraced Silas and welcomed him into the family. But the best moment came when they returned to the cabin as man and wife, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Silas carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing at the old-fashioned gesture, and set her down gently in their home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Boone," he said. "I've been home for a while now," Annie replied. "This just makes it official." That night, they hung a new sign above the door. Silas had carved it himself, working on it in secret over the past few weeks. It read, "Boone and Boyd," in careful letters, with a small pine tree carved in one corner and a heart in the other. "I wanted both our names," Silas explained, "because this place isn't just mine anymore. It's ours. Everything we built, everything we fought for, we did it together." Annie traced the letters with her fingers, tears streaming down her face. "It's perfect." Over the following months, they made the changes they'd dreamed about. They expanded the cabin, adding a sitting room and a larger kitchen. They fixed up the barn and brought in chickens and a gentle milk cow. They planted a garden that Annie tended with the same care Clara once had, using the old ledger as a guide and adding her own notes in the margins. And slowly, carefully, they opened Daniel's room. Together, they sorted through his things, keeping what mattered and letting go of what didn't. They transformed it into a guest room, but left the 2 wooden horses on a shelf, a reminder of the boy who'd once filled this place with laughter. Spring came again, and with it, news that made Annie's heart sing. She was expecting a baby. The joy on Silas's face when she told him was something she'd treasure forever. Not just happiness, but healing. Proof that life continued, that love created new life, that the future they'd fought so hard for was becoming real. When their daughter was born on a crisp October morning, they named her Clara Rose. Clara for the woman whose blessing had made their love possible. Rose for new beginnings. She had Silas's grey eyes and Annie's stubborn determination, and from the moment she entered the world, she was deeply, profoundly loved. On a perfect summer evening, when Clara Rose was almost a year old and toddling around the cabin on unsteady legs, Silas took out his carving knife and walked to the porch railing. Annie followed, watching as he carved a new notch, the first he'd made since before his son's death. "What's this one for?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "For everything," Silas said simply. "For second chances and new beginnings. For love that doesn't end but transforms. For you, for our daughter, for this life we've built together." He set down the knife and pulled Annie close, both of them watching Clara Rose chase a butterfly across the clearing. For learning that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the beginning of a new chapter. Annie leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. She thought about how far they'd both come. From 2 broken people just trying to survive to 2 whole people building a life worth living. It hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks and struggles and moments when giving up seemed like the only option, but they'd chosen differently. They'd chosen to fight, to hope, to love again, despite every reason not to, and in choosing each other, they'd found something more valuable than any property or money or security. They'd found a home not made of logs and stone, but of trust and commitment, and the kind of love that weathers any storm. As the sun set over the Wyoming mountains and their daughter's laughter rang out in the clear evening air, Annie thought about the words she'd spoken to Silas all those months ago. "I'm not here for love, just for work." She'd been so wrong. Or maybe not wrong, maybe just not ready yet to admit what her heart already knew. That sometimes the best things in life are the ones we're not looking for. That sometimes love finds us when we've stopped searching for it. That sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest words. "I've come about the job." She'd come for work, but she'd found so much more. She'd found home, purpose, and a love that transformed 2 broken hearts into something beautiful and whole. And as Silas smiled down at her, his eyes full of the same wonder and gratitude she felt, Annie knew with absolute certainty that she'd never regret taking that long walk up the mountain to a cabin where a lonely man waited for someone to see past his grief to the person he could be again. They'd built their life together plank by plank with both hands and heart, and it was everything she'd ever wanted, everything she'd never dared to hope for. It was home. It was love. It was exactly where she was meant to be. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, and in its voice Annie could almost hear Clara's blessing, telling them what she'd written in that letter all those years ago, that love doesn't end, it transforms, and that the best way to honor what was lost is to embrace what can still be found. They'd found each other, and that was everything.